Hey friends. So I have kind of a somber, I suppose, um, feeling or insight kind of percolating, and it's comes from it's a combination of slightly strange sources because on the one hand, as I spoke about in my post yesterday, a very close friend of my family's passed away 2 days ago. And he's someone who was a guiding spiritual figure in all of our lives. He blessed the unions of my parents and several of at least one of myself and my sibling. And um, so that's one thing that is arising. But then the more oddball source of this feeling is having watched the last few episodes of season 4 of Blackish last night with my wife. And this is a show it's been our go-to kind of like quick, watch something in the evening. They're 20-minute episodes. It's a show that we're 4 seasons deep, and it is ironclad. I mean, every single episode is near perfect. It's a near flawless show through the first 4 seasons. And at the end of season 4, they made a really interesting choice where a show that is essentially a 20-minute sitcom with new material, new treatment, new subject every episode took on a 4 or 5 episode arc where the two main characters, the husband and wife, who are the center kind of the anchors of the show, have marital trouble, and they go into this funk that they can't get out of. And it's both tonally a really bold choice for a show like this, narratively a really bold choice, because all of a sudden it's not an issue that could be resolved in a nice pat way within an episode. They had to go across 4 or 5 episodes, which had not happened with any other story point. No other plot line really took more than an episode to conclude. So it was striking just from the point of view of watching what some pretty interesting and courageous choices that the writers made. But it also struck something home to me because we watched these characters, and by season 4 you're fully in love with the protagonists, right? These are the two. It's like watching them fight is like heart-wrenching because they're so in love, and you just have this picture of a relationship that seems so ironclad. It's funny how invested you can get in, like, the relationship between two TV characters. Anyway, that's for another post. But what happens is they keep diverging, and you watch them kind of have this inevitable divergence from each other, or seemingly inevitable. Their personalities they just both double down on their own ego's way of kind of deflecting responsibility onto the other one. And it gets deep. It's written in such a way as to feel really compelling and feel really true and feel really honest, even though it's all of a sudden we're not watching comedy anymore. We're watching a drama. And for 4 seasons, it's been like not just comedy, but really fun comedy and light comedy. taking on some big issues here and there, but almost always spinning them with lightness. And all of a sudden, the show is letting us go dark. And so you watch them kind of both just like their egos kind of double down on their own way. And then one of the wife's parents passes away. This is the last episode of the season. And of course, this shakes her completely. She's inconsolable, and she immediately needs her husband, who has at this point moved out of the house. He's got another house that he's living in. They're sharing the kids. And this death in the family shakes them. And he comes back, and he's there for her as she processes the grief. And they get back together. Long story short, they find a way back to each other. And it's grief that brings them back together. And they address this at one point later in the show. They address in the episode. They have her say something like, "At first I thought it was just grief that brought us back together, but then I realized," and she goes on to say how they've realized things and why they're why that was just the initial thing that got them back, but now they're willing to work again. And it reminded me, I was like, oh, interesting. I've seen that choice in other movies too. I think the same thing happens in High Fidelity, rom-com from the 90s. The two characters are having trouble finding their way to each other, and then her father passes away, I think, or something like that. And I thought, interesting. Why is it that works narratively? In other words, why is it that an event that causes grief brings people together? Even just in a story, although I happen to think it's also very true in reality, in life. And I thought, the reason certainly has something to do with the fact that grief takes away our ego's ability to feel good. And let's keep in mind, the ego's ability to feel good is always a form of substitute joy. Substitute joy is what the ego feels when something that the ego wants either happens, or something that the ego wants the ego gets, or somehow the ego's vision of what the world should do to make it happy actually comes to pass and makes it happy. The reason that that's substitute joy is because it's always going to be impermanent. It's never going to be permanent. It's always going to be a form of temporary grief, of temporary pleasure or satisfaction that can be taken away again at some point. And this is why, and so grief enters the picture and obliterates all that. Grief enters the picture and takes away something so big or so profound or so meaningful that all the little substitutes no longer work. And we have to fall back into presence. the only way out of grief is to be, I mean, not the only way out. You can distract yourself, you can repress it, you can do all kinds of things to grief and not really feel it. But the best way to employ the gift of grief is to use it to transcend the ego. Because in transcending the ego, grief is alleviated. Grief is dissolved. It's resolved. And we tap into a joy that is not a substitute. And in doing so, we recognize our ability to do so. We see that our capacity to feel joy is not contingent upon the ego's demands. And so we can let them go. We can just stop enacting the compulsions of the ego. And that's essentially what happens in stories, in narratives, when a big, of this kind, when grief is a kind of unifying force. And it's not fake. That's a real thing. That's not just like a nice, neat narrative trick. That actually, I think, has real relevance to the way the world works, to the way that the feeling of the experience of grief truly empowers us to access a deeper part of ourselves where joy actually resides. And the thing about that joy is that it's always shared. It's something that we can effortlessly share. We have in infinite abundance. We don't need to score points to get it. We don't need to get our way to get it. We don't need to be right to get it. We just receive it. And by receiving it, we also share it, which is inherently relational. It builds relationship. It's love. It's a permeation of love, a kind of outward spilling of love, which there's no other way it can go other than to unite people, to draw people closer together. So, I mean, now you can see why these two things are related, because the death of a close friend is obviously an occasion for grief. But especially as this was a spiritual person, a self-declared man of God, and a very committed spiritual seeker, spiritual finder, it just feels appropriate to do our best to employ this occasion as an opportunity to discover the joy that lives in all of us all the time, undiluted, unbroken, occasionally clouded, but always available if we're willing to wake up to it. So that's where I am today. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you soon.